No.
Hello and welcome to the All Good Stories podcast, where we believe all good stories belong to Jesus. And when we look for Jesus in the stories around us, we find him more fully in our own. We're your hosts, Chris Bowden
and Simon Campbell, two millennial dads who love pop culture and making connections from the content we love to the God who loves us.
And we know adventure is out there. So in episode 2, we're going to earn another Wilderness Explorer merit badge as we find the good stories in Up. Hey, thanks for checking out All Good Stories. Before we dive into episode 2, here's a quick refresh on why we're here. We're two guys who keep having hallway conversations at work about the different movies and TV shows we're watching, often nerding out around cinematic details, themes, and even stuff that reminds us about Jesus along the way.
And as people who believe and follow Jesus, we want the stuff we're watching to be another opportunity to talk about him. And we're both dads, and so particularly we want to be able to bring Jesus into the conversation with our kids and our families to help them see Jesus all over the place in their everyday lives.
That's exactly right. And I think we also find that too often we'll see kind of this default in Christian culture to place pop culture and faith as just kind of like natural enemies to one another. And instead, we believe we can grow our perspective to see what's good in really any story we're consuming, and maybe even deepen our faith in Jesus along the way, even when it stretches us beyond what our comfort zone may be.
And to be fair, we're not saying that the makers of these movies or the shows that we talk about here had any intention of having these stories connected to Jesus in any way.
Right.
We're just saying that when you tell a good story, there's going to be something that connects to Jesus because all good stories belong to Jesus.
And there it is. That's enough prefacing for now. Thanks again for being a part of this with us, and let's jump in.
So we're talking about Up, and
yes!
Wow, this is made by Pixar Animation Studios, and I had to double take on this, like 2009 is when it was released.
I don't know about you, this was the year I graduated high school.
Yeah, I was a year before, but it feels like, oh yeah, this is still a new movie. No. But it was released in 2009, huge box office success. $735 million after spending about $175 million to make.
Yeah, that's a good profit.
Yeah. And also, it has acclaim as well. It won not one, but 2 Academy Awards for Best Animated Feature and Best Original Score. That soundtrack is...
It's like its own character in the movie, all on its own. This is a real special one. I need to sneak in a quick shout out to my brother Reed and his wife Emily. This is like a core movie for them. This is like pillar of their relationship. Lots of themes, even into their wedding, in like the most tasteful way you ever could think. Right? You hear like Pixar movie in a wedding theme, you're like, oh no. It was so good. So credit to Reed and Emily if you're listening. I hope you're listening. We're about to talk about your favorite movie of all time. So let's hope we don't ruin it.
So here's the story. We have this main character, Carl, and we are introduced to him as a little boy, actually, who's intrigued with adventure and especially the exploits of this Zeppelin flying adventurer, Charles Muntz, in Paradise Falls, which is a land lost in time. Carl meets this little girl, Ellie, who shares this dream of adventure and going to Paradise Falls, and makes Carl promise to take her. And then in this montage, we sort of see their whole little life together. Carl and Ellie
most wonderful and heart-wrenching introduction to a movie of all
so much
time.
So much happens in this few minutes of footage, and Carl and Ellie get married and grow old together, and they have this dream kind of always going on in the background of going to Paradise Falls. And this is represented by this picture of their clubhouse as kids, which becomes their real house on the cliffs next to Paradise Falls. And at the end of the montage, we see Ellie get sick, and she passes before she and Carl could complete this dream, go to Paradise Falls, do the thing. And this tragedy of unrealized dream hardens Carl into this cantankerous, frustrated old man who seems to just be waiting to die. And so that's where the story really kicks off, and
Yeah.
that's where we
Right.
see him. And like I think that it's so interesting that we have a children's movie with an old man as the central character.
Right. It is not often the animation studio is like, hey, you know who'd be great for a lead in this? The 85-year-old curmudgeon.
Yeah.
Yes, it's like this movie in Gran Torino. It's like very different energies we
Yeah.
get from leads at this age.
Well, and it doesn't. There's a lot about this movie that I don't think fits a lot of the patterns we're accustomed to with
Mhm.
children's movies. It's bizarre in a lot of ways. But as we look at the rest of the synopsis here, kind of everything changes when Carl is forced to leave this home that has meant so
Mhm.
much to him and Ellie, and he just decides to. And this is where it gets really weird. Float his house to Paradise Falls using an enormous mass of balloons. And then we see kind of this unique cast of characters surrounding this adventure of Carl, a boy wilderness explorer, talking dogs, giant bird named Kevin who turns out to be a, mother bird, and and he even meets this idol explorer, Charles Muntz. And we kind of watch this adventure unfold as Carl seeks to sort of realize this dream and make it a reality.
Great recap. We highly recommend go watch it on Disney Plus, which reveals our cards a little bit to say, hey,
Ooh.
Simon, is it a good story? And we're going to make the case that, yeah, this is a great story. But there's a few movie magic details for us that we just love geeking out over that we
Yeah.
think help make it a good story. One of those being this montage we mentioned at the beginning of this recap of their lives, really telling an entire life story in about 10 minutes of screen time.
I don't even think it's that, is it? It's incredible. You build so much connection with the characters in such a short period of time and with no dialogue. That's the moment for me where it's like, oh, I understand how this won an Academy Award. Like, I get it. It's so good.
Yeah, I love that it doesn't hide from some of the realities of life in the story as well. You get them establishing their life, they're painting their house, they've got these great memories. Anyone who is married or been in a relationship probably has a lot of these phases in their own lives. It's very relatable, right? Like you move into this rundown place, you make it your own, you make it
Yep.
work, you establish yourself, and it becomes more emotional as you go. They've
Yeah.
even got this scene where they see babies in the sky. They've got these clouds,
Start thinking babies.
which
Yep.
is super fun, super cute. They're setting up a nursery, and they
Mhm.
have this turn in the story of the loss of a pregnancy in a children's movie, a very grown up theme in here, and kind of their
Or even
wrestle
like
and
an
struggle.
I mean, it's not clear 100%, but it's almost like having children is never going to be a thing for them. You know what I
Right,
mean? Like
right. There's this
that's
heavy
the
theme here. Yeah, whether it's a loss of a pregnancy, whether it's an inability to get pregnant, we don't really know. But
yeah.
you're dealing with a really mature theme that gives this
Mhm.
depth to their relationship that is still very accessible for like a family audience. Like it's not going to be a weird moment for
But
families,
you
right?
get
But
what's
there is,
happening. You Yes.
something's off, something's wrong.
There's one little moment in that montage that is going to stick in my head is when Ellie has received the news. They've come home from the doctor, and you find her sitting in the backyard in a chair with her head kind of held up in, like, you can see the sadness and the loss on her face, but
Mhm.
her chin is up. She's letting the breeze watch. Like, she's not defeated. She's not. There's something so strong and powerful about her
Yeah,
in that
there's
moment too.
like this resilience and hope that persists unspoken, even amidst this grief.
And that's when the dream is reintroduced to, go to Paradise Falls. Carl reintroduces this dream, but that moment of her in the chair, I can think through certain times in my life where I'm like, I know what she's feeling right there.
It's a very good empathetic moment for us as an audience. And then I love as we go on, like they are trying to get towards this goal, this dream, and real life just keeps happening. Like
Yeah.
the car breaks down, and we got a tree falls on their house, and they got to repair their house. There's all these very practical,
Yeah.
real things that ultimately get in the way of this goal. None of which are bad. No one's to blame that this dream doesn't
Yep.
happen. I think the same is true, like in relationships with friends, marriages, family. There are unrealized dreams and hopes and promises that ultimately aren't the fault of anybody. Real life
Yep.
happens and can get in the way.
Yeah, and then that montage finishes with this grief of him navigating the loss of Ellie and all that stuff. And then you have this really poignant moment in the very beginning of the film. And then
Mhm.
we transition to him waking up in this muted world as a grumpy old man, hardened by this tragedy, cracking his back and riding a chairlift down the
Because you do.
stairs.
You come out of this montage literally in a church. He's alone. Your heart is broken as an audience and has this seamless transition to his front steps, which is so smooth. And you're right. How do we possibly go forward from here? Like, I'm emotionally exhausted. Oh, I know. Comedic
Dum dum
chairlift.
dum 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 dum. It's like,
It's that rattle as it just moves down and it kind of stops. He has to hit it and then it keeps going, right? And it's the pacing of that is so good that they take 30 seconds for him to just get down the stairs. Yeah.
no, I love the head wiggle as he's coming down in the chair, like just the slight vibration
A
of the
little like a
chair as it like,
bobblehead thanks
yeah,
to
yeah,
the thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's so good. I think there's a couple other little, movie magic details in here that as I watched through it again, just kind of stopped me in my tracks. Like, whoa, that is such a cool, like everywhere in Carl and Ellie's house, everything that's Carl's is square, which is what his whole, like his
Yeah.
face is a
Yeah.
square.
Literally as like a character shape is a boxy
He's a
person.
square. He's a
Yeah.
square. And so like his bedside lamp is a square. The clock, his glasses frames, the frames,
Oh,
any
that's
frame,
so
any frame in
good.
the house that holds a picture of Carl is square. Any frame in the house that holds a picture of Ellie is round and kind of oval. And so like her
That is
lamp,
so
her
cool.
chair, it's all like you have these hard edges and this rounded. And so you get this sense of complementing, completing, balancing each other. And so like you get
Mhm.
this sense of loss already that like there is this huge
He's
part missing in the
missing this
house.
other half, the
Yes.
person who rounds out his edges, so to
Yeah.
speak. That is so, and because I mean, you get that even at the beginning of the movie. You get introduced to Carl, who has this sense of adventure, but is ultimately you catch on like a pretty shy kid.
Yeah.
He is not a talker, right? He doesn't
Yep.
say a word unless he's by himself. And when he meets Ellie, he just shakes his head
Yeah.
no,
And
yes,
she's so
isn't super
boisterous and
sure.
all that stuff.
Oh,
Even the
she's
wedding,
all
like
over the
you have
place.
his side of the family that's super quiet, and then like there's guns and like woo woo,
Yeah, they're
going
all
off on the
partying on
other
the other
side.
side
Yeah.
already. Yeah, the contrast there is great, but you get this hint that she's the one who really makes Carl face his fears and be brave and adventurous from the beginning. Like he
Yeah.
doesn't really seem like a risk taker, even though he has this heart of adventure in him. And in the house that ultimately comes there, was right, like they're going after this balloon, hint hint, that he's got in the attic. And she forces him to walk out on this plank to go get it. She's like, yeah, go get it. And he's like, okay, I guess I'll go. And then falls through and breaks his arm, right?
Yeah.
But he takes on that risk because she encourages him to and motivates him. I mean, both in that present moment, it seems throughout their lives, and then also, like, interestingly enough, even after her passing, acts as a motivating force for him.
Oh, it's so good.
You mentioned this too, but what I thought was really cool is when you're introduced to Carl in his current state, like the house is worn, the colors are muted, it's lost its life and luster. Great symbolism there to Carl's own life. And then you have Russell show up on the front porch in this bright, obnoxiously vibrant, like
Yeah.
Boy Scout uniform, this wilderness explorer who's like
Yeah.
full of life, right? Like even in like a color palette, he just pops on that front porch. And then ultimately you get that same kind of thing change when the balloons arrive for this great reveal out of this house. Really kind of one of the coolest moments of the movie. It's like, oh, life has kind of returned to him in this story.
It's
Color
like a
has
little
returned.
kaleidoscope that goes through. Yeah.
Oh man, we could like sit all day in that moment when that house drifts by that girl's bedroom window and that kaleidoscope of colors that drift. Oh, that's what dreams are made of. Shots like that. It's so cool. But it introduces the theme again when those balloons show up, right? It's like, oh, we have purpose and meaning and color. That imagery all kind of represents itself again there too. Okay, so that's a bunch of movie magic from us. But beyond that, there are a couple themes in this movie that really caught our attention to say, oh my goodness, these have such a connection to Jesus's character and what he's about, or we can't help but be reminded of Jesus. And so we're going to talk a little about, hey, what in this story we can't help but say, hey, this really belongs to Jesus. He is all over this one. One of the big first ones for us, just this whole idea of keeping promises.
Yeah, this is the thread that runs through the whole movie.
Both the good side and the challenges or dark side of making promises to people.
The first interaction we have between Carl and Ellie, she, very forcefully kind of demands him, promise you'll take us to Paradise Falls. And that runs through the whole movie. There was a couple other parts too where I felt like this thread just kind of kept continuing, and it, different promises, different people. Even at the beginning of the movie, Charles Muntz says, I promise to bring back the beast of Paradise Falls alive, and I won't return until I do,
Right. At this motivation of clearing my name.
And so we have that promise in conflict with the characters, and all the characters are trying to either keep their promises or pursue a promise. I feel like that has to belong to Jesus. And specifically, this cross your heart deal. And I love the first one in the montage, in that scene I mentioned earlier about like she's sitting in the chair and he shows her the picture of Paradise Falls and then makes that motion, after they've had this death of one dream, so to speak, and, moving on to this other one, and, makes that symbol for crossing his heart. And we also have a moment in the adventure once they reach Paradise Falls, that area, and meet Kevin the bird. Russell is asking Carl to, make sure Kevin stays with us. Don't leave him, and asks him to cross his heart. And
and Carl has a pause, right? Because he's like, wait a second.
This
Ellie
is serious.
Asked me to cross my heart, right? Like there's this recollection of her memory in that moment with Russell, right.
And we see it a couple times, even just in the montage, there's a couple times where Carl just makes the motion of cross my heart. Anytime the promise to Paradise Falls comes up, he crosses his heart. So we see this promise work its way through the whole movie, and this cross my heart phrase, it kept coming up as I was watching through this again. This phrase, I think this is a spot where this belongs to Jesus. So I did a good old Google search and looked up where this phrase comes from.
Like a true wilderness explorer, you went to the internet.
Yeah, adventures out there. I mean, I looked up the phrase and tried to find where it originated. And first usage shows up in written usage, shows up in a play in 1857. And it's kind of like an homage to actually the sign of the cross in the Catholic and other Christian traditions, as a sign of the cross of the seriousness of what you're saying, whatever the promise is.
Yeah, and I'm like, hey, we're employing God here as we make this promise. Okay.
And as children kind of picked it up and used it following when it originated, it's a little rhyme, cross my heart and hope to die if I so much as tell a lie. So we
neat. That's so nice and bright for the children. Perfect.
But I think it's a way for us to show the seriousness of the promises, and that's something that belongs to Jesus without us really even noticing, because the seriousness of that promise is sealed in this built-in phrase of cross my heart and hope to die. The reality of that is huge for me. And as we see in a story that we're craving for promises to be kept, we're craving for someone who will keep their promises. As the hero, we're rooting for Carl to keep his promises here. And this is something where I feel like this belongs to Jesus, because Jesus is the only one who keeps all of his promises. And we see that from throughout the Bible. But there's one story in particular that I was drawn to when I was thinking about the nature of promises, and it's in Genesis 15. It's when Abraham is just kind of beginning his journey with God. He's received a promise from God that God will give him children. So he'll have offspring. He's promised him a land, that he would make his name great, and that this nation that God would make out of him, this people group, would be a blessing to all people.
Yeah.
So these are the promises that God has made. But when I look at this story and I think about it in context, Abraham has very little context for God at this point. He's been obedient to him. He has this promise, but he's like, how can I know? And so God's answer to this is sort of like an ancient cross my heart, hope to die situation. If you go back and read this story, it's kind of weird. So
Are you about to hit me with Old Testament imagery here? Okay. All right.
Here
Buckle up.
So you start with tearing apart animals.
Oh,
But
good. Oh, yeah, we
seriously,
are
yep,
right in it.
okay.
Yeah.
But
Classic.
there's this ancient ritual that would have been common at this time of this blood covenant involving animals that would be
Once
ripped in
again, good for the
half.
children.
Yep,
Excellent. Good.
good,
Yep.
good, good, good. Animals ripped in half, and the pieces would be, aligned in this aisle in between them. And what would happen
Mhm.
is when kings or whatever would make a covenant with one another, they would make a promise, and then to say that they were, serious about it, they would walk between these pieces to say, if I break this promise, may this happen to me. May I be torn to pieces. May my blood be spilt on the ground. It's literally like,
Hope to die.
okay. And the oftentimes in these promises, the most powerful king would have the lesser king walk through and say, I promise to be loyal to you, and if I don't, this will happen to me. But what's interesting in this story with Abraham is God tells Abraham, okay, go get these animals. Abraham knows right away what to do, takes the pieces, and it's not Abraham that goes through. It's the symbols representing God's presence. They go through the pieces. And God is literally saying, cross my heart, hope to die. And even if you don't keep your promises, I will. And that's what we see in Jesus. We see Abraham and his offspring and everybody that comes after him never keep their promises, never hold up to what they say.
Does not go well for the descendants of Abraham in promise keeping mode. That's right.
And what do we see? We see him on the cross paying the penalty for all of the broken promises of all of these people. And so when I think of the movie Up, and I think about a character in a story that's craving for a promise kept, this is where I see, and even that phrase, cross my heart, hope to die. We are wanting somebody who will keep their promise no matter what the consequences are. And we see that fulfilled in the person of Jesus.
Another big theme in the movie is adventure is out there, literally a quote of the movie. And really this idea of there's adventure out there in life, even you could say after death, even in grief. This idea of only when you stand to lose everything are you placed in a position where you actually gain what you're meant to be doing or find a new reason and a new purpose.
Yeah.
I can't help but think of Matthew 10:39. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Right.
Yeah.
So a little bit of like contextual key there of, okay, we're talking about Jesus in Matthew. Great. But this whole idea carries through of Carl has to be faced with losing what is most precious to him in order to step into where he ultimately needs to go to grow and develop as a person.
I think that's so right, because there's two moments where we kind of see that in those who seek to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. That verse rings true, I think, in two parts in the movie. We see at the beginning when Carl is, being threatened with losing his home and going into a Shady Oaks retirement home.
Perfect name.
This is great.
Yep.
And that's what finally gives him the push, like, okay, he's going to go and live out this promise. And then the second moment is after that conflict where the house was burned, and he does take the house to Paradise Falls. He sits down, he sits in his chair, and it's just not right. It's not settled. And so
it's not what you thought of. You got everything you wanted.
And all of the precious things that he was trying to preserve throughout this adventure, he pushes right out the door to lighten the load, to literally cast off his burdens so that he can pursue the life that God has called in this adventure. That's what I see. We have to do that in our own lives. We're holding on to things that are keeping us from pursuing the adventure that's out there, the adventure God has called us to.
Yeah. And you see it in such a visually dynamic way. You're like literally pushing things out of the house. And what I like is like that acceptance from Carl on the other side of not only has he pushed himself out of the house, but when he takes off in that house, again, he's thrown on Russell's sash, right?
Yeah.
He's got the merit badge sash on across his chest. I'm like, oh, he's in now. He's in the club, right?
Like
he's part of the Wilderness Explorers.
Over his heart too. I bet that spot is over his heart too. I bet if I go back and watch that, I bet it's right there.
I just want to go boo, boo. But
so
I'll give it to you. That's great.
So what's the deep freeze then in your life then? That's because that's the last thing. That's the last thing that goes out, and it's like all of a sudden,
it's like that stereotypical study guide question of when you watch the movie Up, what's the chest freezer that's keeping your house weighed down? What do you need to let go of to embrace your life with Jesus?
The last thing I think that really belongs to Jesus in here, we have an opportunity to kind of watch a character deal with some really big things and go through this grief and loss. And this adventure that he's carried away on kind of forces the issue. He forces him to deal with these things that he kind of has chosen not to.
Yeah, and there's great symbolism in here where his relationship to the house and to Ellie here are really one and the same. Ellie is no longer with us in this story, and yet we get a representation of her really through Carl's attachment to the house. We literally have him talking to the house when he's talking to Ellie. He'll go like, "What do I do now, Ellie?" And he's looking at his house, or he's in the house and looking around. And we even get Russell who starts to play that game. Like he catches on and says like,
Yep.
"Ellie said I could keep the bird." And he's like, "What? No, she didn't." He gets caught in his own mental game for a moment.
I told him no. Like a parent back and forth arguing.
Yeah. But again, you see like he's caught in that thing. And I think to your point, you literally see the stages of grief play out in this movie. The first one that's really clear is just denial. It takes us 14 minutes until Carl actually talks to somebody in this movie, which is incredible. But he says, "Our house," right? Like, what are you doing to our house?
Well, and he speaks to Ellie. He's speaking to the house like he's speaking to Ellie through the whole time. Like she's still there. She's still involved in doing those things, which is, you're right. I think that that's an expression of his denial that this happened.
He says one of my favorite lines. So you can have our house when I'm dead.
When
slams the door, right? But even in that, you've got such like a sense of control that he has over trying to keep this house. As he takes off shortly after, he gets caught in this storm, and you see him trying to like catch everything in the house and hold on to it and kind of hold his life together, to hold these things together he's holding on to that we just said he ends up letting go of. So you get this great turning point for him later with, the storm, it's literally tied down in one place.
He wakes up in a pile on it, and Russell's like, "I thought you were dead."
And then you have the next stage, you see anger, right? His frustration just with every other person throughout. At no point is he pleased with anyone. And you see that chaos just gets added and added. You've got Russell. Okay, chaos has arrived. You've got this kid. And then you have Kevin. Like, again, one of my favorite movie moments in this is him going, "Shoo, shoo, shoo, go away." And Kevin just goes, just imitates him back, right? Like more chaos, more frustration. And then you have Doug, the talking dog, on top of all of that. He's just the frustration and the anger and trying to like get all through that. It's like, okay, we obviously have stage 2 of you trying to work through your grief here. Just like, this is not at all what I planned. This is not supposed to go. It's just like drudgery of frustration for him.
Tangent time. The reason that the talking dogs work, here's my theory. It's the poor sentence structure and the C-spot run kind of thing. Like, "I want that ball. Yes, throw that ball to me." And the second reason why it works is because you have the alpha, beta, seniority structure of the dogs.
Yes.
And that's what their names are. And Epsilon is the chef. Those are the two things. It gives enough that you're like, oh yeah, they're dogs.
Yeah. And it really, I mean, like, not to, prolong the point, but you see bargaining in here. He's sneaking his way around kind of what he knows is probably the core issue of, if I'm really going to see this thing through with this bird, it's going to come at a cost. But he's lying, sneaking, trying to hold on. He's bargaining his way through this. Right. Yes,
Can I do both?
And then ultimately you have the depression that we've already hit on, where he's at the cliffside, the house is crashed, Russell's gone. He finally gets everything he wanted, but at the expense of this other relationship that he's built, and is faced with a choice. And for me, it's the acceptance side of this that I think is just really beautiful. It's just after Charles Muntz meets his demise here in the movie, and he looks back and the house has drifted off the blimp.
It's like slipping beneath the clouds.
Drifting away. And wouldn't you know it, kind of this heavenly imagery of slipping into the clouds. And he literally says it's just a house.
And that's the first time he doesn't talk about it like it's Ellie.
Yeah, he's made the separation. So acceptance comes in at the end here. And I think it's great. You see this great contrast of Carl's development, as flawed as it is, right? It's very human. It's great in that way. But then you see it compared to, say, the Charles Muntz character, the other old guy in the script. You get these two literally diverging, opposing forces, where you've got Carl who's just getting forced to change and kind of face some different priorities. And then you have Charles Muntz, who has stayed stuck, really kind of this anger, vindictive, I'm going to prove I have made a promise to myself that I've got to clear my name.
Yep.
And you really kind of see the all the issues that come out of that, really like suggested, like he has killed many an adventurer for the
Yes.
sake of getting this
This
bird.
promise. You see both of these men with sort of unfulfilled promises. Carl kind of failed in keeping his promise to Ellie to get her down there.
Hmm.
And Charles has failed in bringing this bird back and restoring his reputation. But the
Hmm.
difference between these two men, one makes them the hero, one makes them the villain, is that Carl navigates this grief and this loss of whatever and
Hmm.
moves on to a new adventure, and Charles hasn't.
Yeah, you get the adventure book of Carl, and then you have the chaos board in the dark conspiracy board of
Oh, that's
Charles,
good.
right? It's
Yeah.
like you get these two very different, like these are paper products have two very different conclusions for us here. And ultimately, they're both faced with a choice at the end. It's Kevin or the house, or
Yeah.
Russell in the house for Carl, and he makes really the right choice. And then you have Charles, who's just so blindly driven
Yep.
by this drive that he jumps out of that window after them, and it's like you've been blinded by it, and it's over. You've
Wow.
met your
Yeah.
end, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's a cool picture of this different type of processing or lack of processing grief that I think is just all over this. Because ultimately, a life with Jesus is not a life without grief. A life of Jesus is not a life without pain and loss. And we need to know how to navigate that personally, but then also know how to navigate that with other people. And we need tools and help and support to navigate these things. And then knowing like there are triggers of these things that we go. There's so many times where Carl is hit by something in the movie that reminds him of Ellie, that causes these little bouts of extra frustration or anger or protection that
Yeah.
we have to be ready for in our own lives. And I think Jesus is just in the middle of all that. In all of these stages, there's opportunities to grow in both our need and comfort of, while not dismissing the reality of what we have to process through when we lose someone or something really, really important to us.
Whatever lost dream or vision that we have for our lives that we're grieving, when we follow Jesus, we know that there is always a greater adventure that we're called to, that we can claim, that we can lay hold of. And when we lose, we can't really ever lose the thing that's most important. And whatever we suffer, whatever we go through, whatever we have to grieve, none of that's going to be wasted or take away from the ultimate adventure that we're pursuing. That's so true. I see it, and you point it out so perfectly. There's a moment that I feel like totally belongs to Jesus. There's this line when Russell is reflecting on this kind of lost relationship with his dad and this flimsy promise that he's kind of holding to, clinging to, desiring that, oh yeah, his dad will come to the, wilderness explorer thing, and he'll come and pin this badge on me. Then we'll sit on the curb and eat ice cream and watch the cars go by. Like he says, I know it sounds boring, but honestly, it's just the boring stuff that I miss the most.
Yeah, I remember the most.
That he remembers the most. Yeah, that's right. And I think that that's a place that I think belongs to Jesus, because the promise of presence is so important there. And I think when we look at our human longings, if we want somebody who is there with us, that cares about us, that knows us, that wants to do the boring, mundane life stuff with us, we have a person in Jesus who didn't leave himself removed from us in his place in heaven, but came down to do the boring stuff. We see him walking with his disciples. We see him eating
at a
in different
time and
places.
place when he chose to be around with no air conditioning, right? Yeah, you couldn't have picked like 2000 when the
He's
internet
doing
came
all the
on, man.
things.
Yeah.
He's a carpenter's son. You know that there was a lot of just like normal projects that he was doing and helping
With
with and being
splinters and
around.
all.
Yes.
Yeah.
He didn't want to miss out on the
Yep.
normal thing. And so I think we see that desire represented in the character of Russell, this desire for just presence, even if it isn't just in the mundane. And that belongs to Jesus, because we have a God who does that for
Yeah.
us.
And what I love in the story is you see it represented in this cool epilogue in the credits. You get this new adventure book with photos of things they're doing with Doug and doing at what I assume is like the Shady Oaks home that he goes to, right? And it's not terrible. Like he ends up liking it. But you get this post that I think is this great thing of there is more life after grief. There is more adventure on the other side. And this really cool connection to more boring everyday things. It's like you get some really cool closure in that story and what could be
Mm-hmm.
like throwaway epilogue credits that the story doesn't end. The story continues, which is so
Yeah.
cool.
And we see the whole kind of the end of the movie is wrapped up with the image of the dream fulfilled. We saw the house disappear into the clouds, but at the end, as a sign of completion of this promise and the promise is fulfilled, we see the house sitting on the cliff next to the falls. And that's the last shot in
Yep.
the movie. That's a symbol for us that
Yeah.
promises have been kept.
Yeah. So those are some themes where we just see Jesus all over the movie Up. And that's fun to talk about. Great to make those connections to Jesus. But okay.
So what?
So what? Who cares? You know, what's that actually mean for us practically?
Yeah. And I think that there's opportunities to bring up real things in a practical way. I think for a children's movie to have such a unique representation of the path of grief for somebody, and
Mhm.
even being able to recognize the emotions that are going on, we can connect that to real people's lives that we know that are going through grief. We can use that as an opportunity to say, hey, are you noticing how Carl is feeling right now? Have we seen that in whoever we know who's lost someone? They might have felt like that at
Yeah.
some point. I think that that's an opportunity for us to kind of, help walk through those stages of
Mhm.
grief with somebody and recognize that Jesus is present in that whole thing and gives us an opportunity to move forward in that process.
Yeah. And I picture even a little bit more of the direct connections too of someday my daughter is going to watch Up and she's going to have grief, loss, whether it's big and dramatic or it's very simple of a lost toy or, a friend moves or something like that. And there's some sort of relatability or connection that's relevant to her own life going like, hey, do you remember when in Up, Carl experienced loss? And it sounds kind of funny as you say it out loud, but I think these are like opportunities for conversation or at least familiarity, right? Of some of these themes and feelings that I remember when I was a kid were not represented in a lot of media, right? It was a lot of action, adventure, be brave, go out, get it, conquer the world, kind of thing. Which, fine, those stories are great, but to have something where there's some sort of empathy or relatability or familiarity in a story where like I just get really excited going, I've got some foundation or reference somewhere where like there's just opportunities, even if it's as we're watching it and she's making connections to things, is pretty fun to dream and think about.
I think the second thing that it gives us an opportunity to talk about is the thread that goes through this whole thing of promises, the importance of keeping promises, the hunger we have for somebody who will keep their promises. And I think that from that standpoint, we have a direct connection to talk about how God always keeps his promises. We can count on what he says and that he died for us to keep his promises to us. And those are things I think that we can, in a movie like this, we can get a sense of that desire for promises to be kept. And then we can make that connection and say, God wanted to keep his promises so much. He loves you so much that he was willing to die on the cross for you.
And understanding culture, like the value and impact of when you make a promise to someone. It's this reminder, both from God, of like the integrity behind a promise. You make it with the intent to keep it. No one makes a promise with the intent of not keeping it to start. It all starts with good intentions. But for us, even saying when you make a promise to someone, that carries weight no matter who it is. And you see it reflected in this movie. Like you see the impact of promises, both realized and unrealized, and their consequences, good or bad. And so it's just another moment to talk about, promises matter. And so when you make a promise, just know what people expect and what does integrity with that look like. And are you willing to go as far as it takes to uphold a promise, or are you rushing into one for a different reason?
I think it's in Matthew 5 or 6 somewhere. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, right?
Oh,
That's what just popped in.
Yeah. No, well said. No, that's right. And I think the last one is we have a savior who wants to do the boring stuff with us. He wants to live in our everyday life with us.
Yeah, we don't have a God that is far off, that we're bothering him, because that was Russell's objection, right? Phyllis or whatever said that he was bothering him,
Yeah.
And we don't have a God who's like that. We don't have a heavenly Father who is distant from us, who doesn't want to be with us. We have a heavenly Father who wants to sit on the curb with us, do the boring stuff, and count red and blue cars and eat ice cream. We can invite God into those everyday moments.
And, so often we think that life with Jesus has to be Everest moment after Everest moment after Everest moment sometimes of like, I had this great worship experience and then I was really close to Jesus. And then I, had this great Bible study. And like sometimes the beauty of a relationship with Jesus, more often than not, is in the mundane every day. One of the reasons why we're doing this podcast is, hey, how can we see Jesus in the everyday stories of our lives? Because he's out there. He's in it. He's in all of it, right?
Yep.
And when we build a muscle to see him in the boring, in the everyday, and seeing why what we do and how we live and how we behave matters to that relationship and how we connect with him because he meets us in it, it just, that's the whole deal. I want to live in a world where Jesus meets me when I make my pot of coffee in the morning. I want to be in a world where Jesus meets me as I make breakfast and try to wake up when I'm really tired and like skip my workout and feel guilty about it. God's still with me in that and he gets it. Doesn't mean I shouldn't still go work out, right? But he's in it. He's with it, and I can talk to him about it.
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
I think the reason that we've had this conversation about this movie, why it matters to give a story like Up to Jesus, is because ultimately when we see a story that is craving to have these promises kept, we can see how this story points to Jesus, the one who always keeps his promises, because the reality is Jesus is the one who keeps all of the promises. Even in this movie, Charles Muntz has this desire and makes this promise to restore his reputation. And even though he can't do that, Christ can do that for us. We see Jesus restoring our reputation. No matter how tainted we've made it, no matter how much we've messed up, he can fulfill that promise for us. We see this desire for this fulfilled promise for Russell, that his dad would be with him and be this presence to do the boring things. And we can see that promise fulfilled in the person of Jesus, because we have a Savior who's with us always from now until the end of the age. We have this promise that Carl makes to not leave Kevin behind, to not leave or forsake you. And we see this promise fulfilled in the person of Jesus, who says that I will never leave you. We have this ultimate promise in the movie of Up that Carl makes to Ellie to take her to paradise, to Paradise Falls, to a land lost in time.
Oh, come on.
And we see this promise fulfilled in the person of Jesus, who says, I've prepared a place for you that's outside of time, outside of suffering, outside of pain. And how does he keep this promise? He did more than cross his heart. He placed his heart on a cross because he loves us, because he loves you, and he died so that you and I could have that hope. And I think this story, when we give it to Jesus, can point to the hunger of the human heart to have someone who will always keep their promises. And Jesus is the fulfillment of that in this story, and can be in our story, because all good stories belong to Jesus.
So Simon so eloquently put it here at the end. Those are just a few ways we can give this story to Jesus, and how we can grow our relationship with him when we lean into these themes and really kind of starting to apply some of that, or seeing the opportunity to see this story in our own lives. In contrast, here's one way we should not give this story to Jesus, with another cheap Christian knockoff of the story Up. A heartwarming tale following the adventures of an elderly Sunday school teacher, Ethel, and her quirky sidekick, youth pastor Pete, as they embark on a journey to spread the gospel, one helium balloon at a time. ChatGPT proudly presents Up, Up, and Hallelujah. No. Residing in a modest church that's about to be torn down for a mega mall, they hatch a plan to save their church by tying balloons to the church and floating it to the Holy Land to prove the power of faith. As they soar through the skies, Ethel starts preaching to the birds and clouds, while Pastor Pete attempts to parachute down to spread the gospel to unsuspecting skydivers. Never actually making it to the Holy Land, they crash land back where they started. The Mega Mall developers are so moved by their dedication that they decide to build around the church instead.
That is so bad.
That is like the worst.
ChatGPT, you kind of let me down a little bit here, because it's not even like a great It's not even a good parody,
The
but
narrative arc here is not great. Yeah.
yeah, the whole the Mega Mall thing there. Oh, good gracious.
Yeah,
But
just build around it. We
but
just
here's the
start.
thing. I do think that it's so bad that I could foresee that actually being in a curriculum somewhere. Like a Sunday school curriculum
This
somewhere.
is your opportunity to evangelize to those mega
This
mall
is
builders.
relevant.
They're going to
This
see
is
your
relevant. It's like
dedication.
that popular movie from 2009.
So there you go. There is a poor way of giving this story to Jesus. Well, Simon, all good things must come to an end, including this podcast.
Thanks again for joining us for episode 2. And we really hope this was useful and valuable and sparks a conversation about Jesus wherever you are.
And we would love to keep the conversation going with you no matter where you are, because there's all sorts of other good stories and awesome nuances to explore in this movie and others. And you can track us down to talk about your thoughts, insights, questions, all those good things on Instagram at All Good Stories Podcast. We would love to keep the conversation going and keep learning from you.
But in the meantime, remember that all good stories belong to Jesus.
And if you choose to give your story to Jesus, you can be sure he'll make it a good one.